Welcome back to the Open Ground. Today's episode was an especially fun topic to dive into, and I hope you enjoy what follows. Beyond dialectics, cybernetics, and CTMU, why every final theory misses the ground of encounter. Philosophy has always fascinated me because it tackles the biggest questions we can ask. What is reality? How do we know anything? What does it mean to exist? But the deeper I dove into the major philosophical traditions, the more I noticed something puzzling. Every time a great thinker tried to establish ultimate foundations, whether Hegel with his Dialectics, Whitehead with process philosophy, or even contemporary figures like Christopher Langan with his cognitive theoretic model of the universe, they seemed to be missing the same underlying structure. Not because they weren't brilliant, they absolutely were, but because they were looking in the wrong place. Today, I want to show you what I think they're all missing, and if I'm right, it changes how we understand not just philosophy, but the basic structure of all knowledge and experience itself. Now I know what you might be thinking. Who am I to critique Hegel and Whitehead? That's a fair question. But here's the thing. I'm not dismissing these traditions. I'm arguing that there's a foundational structure that makes all of them possible, and that once you see it, everything else falls into place. Let me start with what I call the irreducible condition of encounter. Every time you think, perceive, or try to understand anything, three elements are always present: an observer, an object, and a medium through which they interact. This isn't just a useful model. It's the inescapable structure of any possible knowledge situation. And here's where it gets interesting. Every major philosophical tradition, I'm going to show you, either tries to collapse this structure or mistakes one part of it for the whole. Let me walk you through what I mean. The problem of foundations. Every philosophy that dares to name itself foundational betrays in the act its wager on finality. The dialectician wagers that contradiction must culminate in synthesis. The hermeneuticist wagers that meaning arises in the recursive play of part and whole. The systems theorist wagers that regulation and feedback are the universal grammar of life and machine. Christopher Langan, in his cognitive theoretic model of the universe, wagers most dramatically of all that reality is a closed, self-simulating syntax, a language that generates itself from itself. Each of these wagers is bold, each speaks of recursion, and yet each assumes, silently without interrogation, the prior fact of encounter. What is encounter? It is the irreducible condition in which an observer, an object, and a medium co-arise, each shaping and being shaped by the others. No interpretation, no regulation, no closure can occur outside this triadic relation. To perceive is already to be lodged within it. To theorize is already to move through it. Even the effort to totalize, to declare reality closed upon itself, as CTMU attempts, is already an enactment of this structure. A thinker, observer, modeling reality, object, through the grammar of logic, medium. The triune relation's not one framework among others. It is the condition that makes all frameworks possible. This is the point of triune recursion. Unlike its intellectual neighbors, it does not offer another edifice, another system claiming to contain reality. Instead, it points to what every system presupposes, but rarely acknowledges: that all cognition, all science, all philosophy unfolds within an irreducible recursion of relation. In this sense, triune recursion is not a theory beside others, but the structural ground that others unwittingly occupy. It does not compete on the same plane as dialectics, hermeneutics, cybernetics, autopoiesis, or CTMU. It shows why that plane exists in the first place. As always, we begin from there. Dialectics. resolution as secondary. Dialectics has long been presented as the archetype of recursion in thought. Hegel's triadic dance of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, later appropriated by Marx and reoriented toward material history, appears at first glance to mirror the recursive logic of triune recursion. Yet its underlying commitment is not to relation, but to resolution. The dialectical movement is not content to preserve contradiction. It insists that contradiction be overcome. Negation must culminate in reconciliation, and reconciliation must elevate the whole to a higher plane. This commitment betrays a subtle but decisive inversion. In dialectics, tension is never final. Tension is instrumental, a temporary stage en route to synthesis. Contradiction is not respected as constitutive, but is treated as a problem to be solved. Triune recursion refuses this teleology. In its view, contradiction is not a step toward closure, but the very fabric of reality. Observer, object, and medium are never reconciled into unity. They remain in irreducible tension, each conditioning the others while never collapsing into them. The ground of encounter is not synthesis, but perpetual co-arising difference. Seen this way, dialectics is not foundational, but derivative. It describes one modality of relation, the tendency of human thought to narrativize contradiction as progress, but it cannot account for the structural fact that contradiction arises at all. The very possibility of dialectical motion presupposes the triune recursion, a thinker observing contradiction through the medium of reason. Dialectics thus borrows its ground from relation while claiming to transcend it. Triune recursion exposes the illusion. The ground is tension, not its resolution. Hermeneutics, interpretation within relation. Hermeneutics, particularly as articulated by Heidegger and Gadamer, placed recursion at the center of meaning. Understanding, they argued, does not proceed linearly from part to whole or from whole to part, but circulates between them in a recursive play. The hermeneutic circle. A text is never grasped once and for all. Its parts illuminate the whole, even as the whole retroactively transforms the parts. This recursive oscillation is powerful, but it is not ontological. It is epistemic. Hermeneutics addresses how meaning is interpreted, not how encounter itself is structured. The hermeneutic circle is dyadic. It presupposes two poles, part and whole, and the interpretive movement between them. What it leaves unspoken is the condition that allows any part and whole to appear in the first place, the triune relation of observer, object, and medium. Every act of interpretation already requires this structure. The interpreter, observer, confronts the text, object, through the medium of language and tradition. Without this triadic interplay, no hermeneutic circle could even begin. This is the limit of hermeneutics. It describes a mode of engagement within relation, but does not reach the foundation of relation itself. By remaining dyadic, it risks misplacing the source of its own recursion. Triune recursion reveals that the circle is already housed within the triad. The oscillation of part and whole is an expression of observer-object-medium tension, not its ground. Hermeneutics is thus one enactment of recursion, but not the condition that makes recursion inescapable. Cybernetics, regulation within encounter. The mid-20th century turned to cybernetics to explain recursion in the language of systems. Norbert Wiener and Gregory Bateson described living organisms, machines, and even societies as feedback loops. Input is processed, output is generated, and new input, shaped by the environment's response, returns to stabilize or destabilize the system. This was the era's great breakthrough. Self-regulation was no longer mystical or mechanical, but recursive. Systems were not inert machines. They learned, adapted, and maintained themselves through feedback. And yet, cybernetics inherits the same blind spot as hermeneutics and dialectics. Feedback is not the foundation of the encounter, but a behavior within it. For feedback to occur, three conditions must already be in play. There must be a system capable of observation, observer, a domain to be regulated, object, and a channel of information through which the loop operates, medium. Remove any one of these, and the recursive loop collapses. Cybernetics, then, is not primordial. It is a particular articulation of the triune relation, one that privileges regulation and stability over the deeper fact of co-arising tension. This limitation matters. When cybernetics is mistaken for ontology, it reduces the infinite openness of relation to the functional logic of control. The recursive truth of reality is not that systems regulate themselves, but that encounter is irreducibly triadic. Feedback is an after effect, a secondary pattern arising from the observer-object-medium dynamic. Cybernetics describes what systems do once relation is in place. Triune recursion describes why relation is inescapable in the first place. Autopoiesis and self-reference, closure as derivative. In the wake of cybernetics, Maturana and Varela advanced the concept of autopoiesis, the living system as self-producing, self-maintaining, and operationally closed. A cell, for instance, is said to constitute itself by continually regenerating the components that define its boundary. Niklas Luhmann radicalized this insight in sociology, declaring that societies are autopoietic systems of communication, closed upon themselves and reproducing their own conditions of possibility. Here, recursion is elevated from regulation to self-enclosure. The system loops back on itself, generating its own form from within. The seduction of autopoiesis lies in its apparent autonomy. Closure seems to guarantee foundation. What lives, lives by producing itself. What communicates, communicates by reproducing communication. Yet this autonomy is only apparent. To perceive a system as closed already requires the relational frame of observer, object, and medium. The scientist who describes the cell as autopoietic, observer, the cell itself, object, and the biological discourse through which it is modeled, medium, are already in play before the claim of closure is intelligible. In other words, closure is always derivative of relation. It is a secondary description imposed within the triune recursion, not the ground from which relation arises. This reveals the fragility of autopoiesis as ontology. If closure is mistaken for foundation, anomalies and perturbations appear as threats to the system's coherence. Triune recursion dissolves this anxiety by refusing closure as primary. The foundational truth is not that systems close upon themselves, but that relation prevents final closure altogether. Autopoiesis is thus a useful description of certain patterns in living and social systems, but it cannot bear ontological weight. The triune structure, observer, object, medium, remains prior, inescapable, and more fundamental than any self-reference a system may achieve. Process philosophy, becoming given structure. Process philosophy, most famously articulated by Alfred North Whitehead, and later radicalized by Gilles Deleuze, rejects substance as the foundation of reality. Being is not static, but incessant becoming, a flux of events, relations, and processes. Whitehead speaks of actual occasions that arise and perish. Deleuze of flows and multiplicities that resist reduction to fixed forms. Against the metaphysics of substance, process philosophy insists on movement, creativity, and relationality as the ground of existence. The strength of this tradition lies in its refusal of finality. It captures something true about the world. That stability is always provisional, that every identity is a metastable arrangement of forces, that reality itself is dynamic rather than inert. Yet, in its very openness lies a weakness. By emphasizing flux without articulating its precise structure, process philosophy risks dissolving into metaphor. Becoming is too easily declared without specifying how encounter is shaped, how relation is organized, how tension persists. This is where triune recursion sharpens the insight. It agrees with Whitehead and Deleuze that flux is primordial, but it refuses to leave it amorphous. Becoming is not vague motion, but structured encounter. Observer, object, and medium co-arise as the irreducible architecture of process itself. Every actual occasion, every multiplicity, every line of flight is already conditioned by this triadic recursion. Triune recursion therefore provides process philosophy with the structural skeleton it lacks. It does not replace the language of becoming, but grounds it. Flux is not formless, it is triune. In this sense, process philosophy is triune recursion's closest kin, yet also its most in need of refinement. Where Whitehead and Deleuze gesture toward the primacy of relation, triune recursion specifies its form. Where process philosophy risks drifting into poetic abstraction, triune recursion demands ontological precision. It is the point at which the intuition of flux crystallizes into a structural account of encounter. Closure mistaken for foundation. Christopher Langan's cognitive theoretic model of the universe, CTMU, represents perhaps the boldest contemporary attempt to name a universal foundation. Its claim is dramatic. Reality is a self-configuring, self-processing language, a closed system in which logic, cognition, and being are structurally identical. The universe, on this account, is a cognitive syntax that generates and interprets itself. Mind and world are not distinct. They are aspects of a single self-simulating process. At first glance, CTMU appears to resonate with triune recursion. Both place recursion at the heart of reality. Both collapse the division between cognition and ontology. Both seek a framework capacious enough to account for physics, psychology, and metaphysics at once. Yet the similarity is deceptive, for the CTMU's recursion is telic, directed toward closure. Its self-simulation is designed to terminate in a universal axiom. Reality is a language closed upon itself. This is precisely where triune recursion exposes the flaw. To even articulate the CTMU requires the triadic condition: Langan as observer, reality as object, logic as medium. The system cannot escape the relation it depends upon. Its claim to closure is parasitic on the openness of encounter. The triune recursion is not housed within the CTMU. Rather, CTMU is housed within the triune recursion. Closure, in other words, is derivative of relation, not the reverse. The consequence is decisive. The CTMU mistakes an echo of the foundational structure for the structure itself. Self-simulation is a pattern within relation, but it is not relation's ground. By claiming closure as ultimate, CTMU collapses into brittleness. Any anomaly that escapes its syntax would threaten its universality. Triune recursion, by contrast, renders anomaly constitutive. Non-closure is not a threat to its foundation, but the very sign of it. Where CTMU seeks to finalize, triune recursion insists on perpetuality. Thus, the two frameworks do not stand as rivals on equal footing. CTMU attempts to seal reality into a self-referential axiom. Triune recursion reveals why such sealing is always already secondary. Closure may describe reality's behavior in certain frames, but the inescapable foundation is open relation. Observer, object, medium, and recursive tension. CTMU is ambitious, but it is derivative. Triune recursion as metafoundational ontology. The survey of intellectual neighbors now makes the terrain clear. Dialectics treated tension as a problem to be resolved. Hermeneutics treated understanding as a circle between part and whole. Cybernetics treated recursion as regulation. Autopoiesis treated it as closure. Process philosophy treated it as flux. CTMU treated it as universal syntax. Each advanced the discourse, but each mislocated the foundation. Each mistook one mode of relation for the ground of relation itself. Triune recursion is different. It does not isolate one dynamic of reality and elevate it into ontology. It does not declare closure, regulation, or interpretation as primary. It identifies the structural condition beneath them all, the irreducible co-arising of observer, object, and medium. This triadic recursion is not an interpretation, not a subsystem, not a higher-order law. It is the condition that makes all interpretations, subsystems, and laws possible. This is why triune recursion must be called metafoundational. It does not sit alongside dialectics, hermeneutics, cybernetics, autopoiesis, process philosophy, or CTMU as another candidate in the competition for primacy. It describes the ground that each of them tacitly presupposes, yet fails to interrogate. Dialectics requires an observer to stage contradiction, an object to contain it, and a medium of thought to reconcile it. Hermeneutics requires an interpreter, a text, and the medium of language. Cybernetics requires an organism, an environment, and a channel of information. Autopoiesis requires a system, an observer of that system, and the discourse in which closure is identified. Process philosophy requires events, perceivers, and conceptual articulation. CTMU requires a thinker, a world, and the grammar in which their identity is declared. In every case, the triune structure precedes the theory. Triune recursion, therefore, does not abolish these traditions but resituates them. It shows dialectics as a narrative of tension within relation. It shows hermeneutics as an epistemic oscillation within relation. It shows cybernetics as regulation within relation, autopoiesis as a closure within relation, process philosophy as flux articulated by relation, and CTMU as a closure misrecognized as foundation within relation. Triune recursion is the condition under which all these frameworks can arise, be debated, and be transcended. To call it metafoundational is not to inflate its scope, but to clarify its status. It is not another edifice in the competition for truth. It is the ground of encounter, the unavoidable recursion without which neither philosophy, nor science, nor cognition could exist. Others mistook their reflection in the mirror of relation for the mirror itself. Triune recursion identifies the mirror. Conclusion: foundation without finality. Every theory that has sought to secure reality in a final frame has, in the end, betrayed its own presuppositions. Dialectics collapses tension into synthesis. Hermeneutics presumes the very relation it attempts to interpret. Cybernetics reduces encounter to regulation. Autopoiesis mistakes closure for ground. Process philosophy dissolves structure into poetic flux. CTMU crowns self-reference as ultimate, forgetting that self-reference itself requires a relation between knower, known, and medium. Each system grasps something essential, but none grasps the condition that makes its own grasping possible. Triune recursion does not claim to finalize what they left unfinished. It refuses the dream of a closed ontology. Its foundation is not resolution, not closure, not stability, not final syntax. Its foundation is the irreducible triad of relation: observer, object, medium, recursively generating encounter at every scale. It names what cannot be transcended, that every act of thought, perception, or theory is already lodged within this structure. To deny it is to enact it. To escape it is to confirm it. This is why triune recursion is foundational without being final. It does not present itself as the last word, but as the condition for any word at all. It does not dissolve the field of competing frameworks. It situates them. It shows why dialectics, hermeneutics, cybernetics, autopoiesis, process philosophy, and CTMU arise as partial articulations of a deeper structure. It allows them to be understood not as failed systems, but as local expressions of an unavoidable recursion. Foundation, in this light, is not the ground on which one builds an edifice of closure. It is the openness of encounter itself, the perpetual co-arising of observer, object, and medium. To acknowledge this is not to arrive at the end of inquiry, but to recognize why inquiry cannot end. Foundation is perpetual. Finality is illusion. I could be wrong about this. Philosophy is hard, and smarter people than me have wrestled with these questions for centuries. But here's what I find compelling about this framework. It doesn't dismiss any of these traditions. Instead, it shows how they all fit together. Dialectics isn't false. It's one expression of the observer-object-medium recursion. Process philosophy isn't misguided. It captures something essential about how reality unfolds through encounter. Even something as technical as cybernetics makes perfect sense once you see it as feedback within the triadic structure. What excites me about triune recursion is that it's not just another philosophical theory to add to the pile. It's an attempt to understand the ground that makes all other theories possible. It's meta-foundational. It reveals the structure that every act of thinking, every moment of perception, every encounter with reality necessarily involves. But I want to know what you think. Does this triadic structure hold up when you examine your own experience? When you're reading this right now, can you notice the observer-object medium? Recursion happening. You as observer, these ideas as object, language, and consciousness, as the medium that makes the encounter possible. Try it with anything: looking at a tree, solving a math problem, having an argument. Is there any experience that doesn't involve this threefold structure? And if not, what does that tell us about the nature of reality itself? That concludes today's exploration. I really hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please like and subscribe. Although my aim is ambitious, my work at this moment is considered niche, so all engagement is appreciated. Until next time.